What if the quietest girl in school, the one they mocked, ignored, and told to sit in the back, turned out to be the daughter of a musical legend they tried to erase? What if her performance wasn't just revenge, but the spark that exposed a teacher's hidden past and burned down decades of silent injustice? This isn't just about a violin. It's about what happens when truth takes the stage and refuses to bow. Her name is Elena Monroe, and the moment she played, the silence became impossible to ignore. Before we dive into this true story of talent, sabotage, and justice through music, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And if this story hits you hard, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you powerful stories like this one. Now take a breath, because the first note changes everything. The first day of auditions at Winslow Preparatory Academy was supposed to be simple. It was tradition. Each year, the school's top music students would showcase their talents to be selected for the Spring Classical Showcase, an elite event attended by alumni, press, and scouts. It was a hallway lined with ambition, glossy violin cases, polished shoes, and proud parents waiting by the gates. But when Elena Monroe, a soft-spoken black girl with second-hand sneakers and a worn-out violin case, stepped into the audition room, the energy shifted. She sat quietly in the back row, her violin resting across her lap like something sacred. No eye contact, no attempt to be noticed. But she was Mr. Jackson Blythe, the long-standing head of the music department, stood at the front of the room with a clipboard in one hand and a frown already forming on his lips. The man was a pillar of classical purity, rigid, traditional, and unyielding. He scanned the list of names. Elena Monroe, he called. She raised her hand slightly. Present. There was a pause. Mr. Blythe's eyes narrowed, studying her as if she'd wandered into the wrong building. "You're here for violin?" he asked, tilting his head, the disbelief practically dripping from his voice. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. He gave a thin, diplomatic smile, the kind that hides a dagger. "Are you sure you don't want to try something with more rhythm? We have an excellent percussion program, or even vocal music, something that aligns more naturally." A few students chuckled. Someone behind Elena whispered, "Yikes." Another mimicked a drumbeat under their breath. Elena didn't respond. She just looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her violin case. Mr. Blythe cleared his throat. "Well, unfortunately, our audition slots for violin are full. But thank you for your interest. We do appreciate diversity in the arts." He moved on. That was it. No chance to play. No chance to be heard. She had been disqualified without touching a single string. Later that day, Elena sat alone under the school's crumbling outdoor amphitheater. She didn't cry. She just opened her case, tightened the bow, and played. The notes flowed out like water through cracks, raw, unfiltered, painfully beautiful. But someone was listening. Ms. Tran, the assistant music instructor, had heard about the audition. She hadn't agreed with how Blythe handled it, but she had seen it too many times to be shocked. So when she heard music drifting through the wind, pure, haunting, unshakably real, she followed the sound. She didn't say a word, just stood silently behind the bleachers and watched as Elena poured everything into the air. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating. When Elena finished, she looked up, startled to see someone there. Ms. Tran simply nodded. "Play that again," she said softly. That was the first moment someone saw her, not as a symbol, not as a checkbox, but as an artist. What Elena didn't know was that Mr. Blythe's dismissal wasn't about a full schedule or audition policies. It was personal, deeply personal, because once a long time ago, he had faced someone who played like her, and he never forgot how that ended. The week after auditions, Winslow Prep buzzed with the same names it always did: Chloe Stanton, Jacob Greer, and Ella March. Students whose families donated pianos to the school, whose last names were printed on auditorium plaques, whose achievements, like clockwork, would be celebrated in the spring showcase. But in the quiet corners of the music wing, something unexpected was beginning to shift. Elena Monroe now practiced in secret. Ms. Tran, moved by what she heard that day, had begun leaving the practice room door accidentally unlocked after hours. She said nothing, left no instructions, but every evening, when the halls emptied and the sun dipped behind the clock tower, Elena stepped into that little room and filled it with sound. Ms. Tran listened from behind the supply closet wall, where the acoustics were best. Every night she stayed later than she should, and every night she grew more convinced. This girl didn't just belong. She could change everything. But not everyone wanted change. Across campus, in a mahogany-paneled office decorated with framed photos and old vinyl records, Mr. Blythe stood in front of a dusty shelf. He pulled out a leather portfolio. Inside was a photo, Clarice Monroe, radiant under the lights of Carnegie Hall, her violin cradled like a weapon of grace, her smile confident, her posture perfect. His name, Jackson Blythe, was printed beside hers in a yellowed program from a competition 2 decades past. Clarice had taken first place. Blythe hadn't even placed in the top 5. The press back then hadn't been kind. One article was titled, "Classical Rewritten, Black Woman Destroys the Old Guard." He had smiled through clenched teeth, shaken her hand, and disappeared into obscurity, retreating into the safety of academia. He told himself he had chosen a higher path, nurturing young talent. But that lie wore thin each time he heard Clarice's name whispered in music circles. And now, her daughter had walked into his classroom, looking just like her. That same poise, that same fire under the skin, the same way of holding a violin not as an instrument, but as a voice. He couldn't allow it. The following Monday, a staff meeting was held. Casual, routine, just another administrative update, until Blythe brought up a new topic. "I wanted to propose some adjustments," he said smoothly, adjusting his tie. "In light of our upcoming showcase, we should be especially mindful of maintaining a certain standard, both in skill and in, well, representation." Principal Hayes, half distracted by his phone, barely looked up. "Meaning?" "Well," Blythe said, pausing with rehearsed concern, "there's been a push for inclusivity, of course, which I support, but we shouldn't let it compromise the event's classical integrity. We need artists who understand the discipline, not just those who play with passion." Ms. Tran's eyes narrowed. She knew exactly what he was doing. Later that day, she found Elena behind the school, practicing under the shade of a crumbling brick arch. She handed her a folded paper. "The student-run spring preview is next Friday," she said. "No auditions required. You can sign up anonymously if you want. Just let them hear you." Elena took the paper, confused. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Ms. Tran hesitated. "Because 20 years ago, I watched your mother break the world open with her bow, and I watched what the world did to her afterward." Elena froze. "You knew her?" "I studied under her," Ms. Tran said softly, "and I watched her walk away from everything she loved, because people like Jackson Blythe made her feel like she didn't belong in her own brilliance." The wind carried a single falling leaf between them. Elena's grip on the paper tightened. She'd spent her whole life trying to stay invisible. But maybe it was time to be seen, whether they were ready or not. The spring preview wasn't the real event, not officially, but it was a proving ground. It was a student-run performance night held in the school's smaller auditorium, a low-stakes showcase of original pieces and raw talent. No grades, no panels, no pressure, just a stage, a mic, and a name. Unless your name was Elena Monroe, Ms. Tran helped her sign up anonymously. No name on the program, just the initials EM buried among open mic acts, acoustic guitar duos, and slam poets. She told Elena, "Let them love the music before they know the name." For 3 nights straight, Elena rehearsed in the practice room, working a piece she called Unfinished Fire. It wasn't perfect. That was the point. It cracked. It soared. It mourned. And above all, it demanded to be heard. But Elena wasn't the only one preparing for the night. Across campus, inside a dimly lit equipment room, Mr. Blythe stood beside the tech assistant, Kyle Hastings, a senior who worked part-time managing lights and sound for school events. Kyle wasn't a bad kid, just someone who liked staying on good terms with authority. "Keep the mics balanced," Blythe said, pretending to look over the checklist. "But if performer number 14, let's say, if their violin output feels a bit overpowering, we might need to bring it down. Don't want distortion ruining the tone." Kyle squinted. "You want me to adjust the levels, Liv?" "Only if it feels needed," Blythe said, smiling thinly. "Trust your ears. We don't want anyone's equipment to outshine their ability, do we?" Kyle nodded hesitantly. He didn't know performer 14 was Elena Monroe. Blythe made sure of that. On the night of the event, Elena wore black. No makeup. Hair pulled back. She didn't want distractions. All she brought was her violin and a borrowed bow that frayed at the edges. Backstage, she waited in silence, listening as other acts filled the room with laughter and applause. From behind the curtain, she could see the crowd, students, teachers, and even some parents sitting shoulder to shoulder under warm lights. But none of it mattered. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing for herself. When her number was called, performer 14 EM, there was no recognition in the crowd, just polite clapping and curious murmurs. She stepped into the spotlight, placed the violin under her chin, and closed her eyes. The first note was delicate, trembling with vulnerability. The second, stronger. By the third, the room had gone still. Conversations halted. Phones lowered. Even the air felt suspended. But something was wrong. The volume was low. Too low. Elena adjusted her stance, drew the bow harder. Still, the sound barely reached the back row. The subtleties, the vibrato, the edge of emotion, were being swallowed. In the sound booth, Kyle fidgeted with the sliders, unsure. Blythe stood behind him, arms folded, face unreadable. "She's playing too hot," Blythe murmured. "Bring it down a little more." Kyle hesitated, then obeyed. Back on stage, Elena's heart raced. She could feel the music leaving her fingers, but not reaching the room. Doubt crept in. Was it her technique? Was she losing control? She pushed harder, bending the strings like cries. She poured herself into every shift, every slide. Her fingers began to tremble from tension, her arms from pressure. By the time the final note came, it was nearly silent. The room heard more emotion than sound, and for a few seconds there was only stillness. Then applause. Light, unsure, scattered. A few students clapped out of politeness. Others looked around, confused. The power of the piece hadn't translated. Not completely. Backstage, Elena stepped off trembling. Not from nerves, but confusion. Was it her? But MS. Tran was waiting, her expression tight. She had sat in the 5th row. She knew what had happened. "Your mic was cut," she whispered. "What?" Elena blinked. "They dropped your gain to almost nothing." "That wasn't you. It was sabotage." Elena's breath caught in her throat. And for the first time since arriving at Winslow Prep, she didn't feel small. She felt angry. That night, she didn't sleep. She took apart her violin, cleaned the strings, and rewrote her entire composition. If they were afraid of her voice, then she was going to give them something they could never silence. 2 days after the spring preview, a school-wide announcement went out. Due to an outstanding performance in our recent showcase, we're pleased to announce a late addition to the Spring Classical Showcase, Elena Monroe. The halls buzzed, not because of admiration, because of confusion. Elena, who? The quiet girl from Mr. Clark's homeroom. You mean the violin chick? That was her. The praise wasn't universal. It wasn't even respectful. It sounded like disbelief dipped in cynicism. And no one was more vocal about it than Mr. Blythe. He didn't argue directly. He was too careful for that. Instead, he let his disapproval fester in whispers and phrasing. In a faculty meeting, when asked about Elena's inclusion, he offered a tight smile. "It's important that our student body feels represented," he said. "In today's world, showcasing diversity of background is just as vital as showcasing technical skill." MS. Tran stiffened in her seat. "She earned her spot," she said flatly. "I'm sure she did," Blythe replied smoothly. But we have to be mindful. Audiences, especially those attending for classical integrity, tend to notice when standards shift. No one said anything after that, but the silence was louder than applause. By the end of the week, Elena felt it, in the way students looked at her, like she was part of a brochure, not the music. Like her success belonged to someone else's agenda. Chloe Stanton, a violinist from the Honors Conservatory, confronted her outside the music room. "I heard you're playing the showcase now," she said, arms crossed. "That's cool." Elena nodded slowly. "Yeah." Chloe tilted her head. "You know, they usually don't let late entries in, but I guess it's different this year." Elena blinked. "Different how?" "You know, with the whole equity thing." Chloe's voice dropped as if that made it softer. "Not that you didn't play well, or whatever." And there it was again. Not that you didn't play well. Not that you don't deserve it. Not that you didn't earn it. Elena didn't answer. She just walked away. But it followed her. During rehearsal, she overheard two cellists whispering behind their stands. "Do you think she's even classically trained?" "Probably YouTube taught." The sting wasn't in the words themselves. It was in how casual they were, like it was just another opinion. When Ms. Tran passed Elena in the hallway later that day, she noticed the slump in her shoulders. "They're not clapping for your music," Elena said quietly. "They're clapping for the narrative." Ms. Tran stopped her. "Let them say what they want," she replied. "But when the curtain rises, all they'll hear is truth, and they won't be able to dismiss that." "But what if they still do?" Elena asked. "What if I'm just another symbol to them?" Ms. Tran looked her dead in the eye, then burned the symbol down with your sound. Meanwhile, in a closed-door conversation with Principal Hayes, Mr. Blythe laid down his final maneuver. "She's not ready," he insisted. "Her technique is still raw. And if we place her in that prime-time slot, we risk compromising the reputation of the entire showcase." Hayes rubbed his temple, but the board liked the press. "Elena's inclusion is already on our social media. The district's sharing it." Blythe leaned in. "Then move her to the opening slot. No spotlight. Let the real performers carry the core of the show." Hayes hesitated. "That'll look intentional." "Exactly," Blythe said with a smile. "Intentional balance." The principal sighed and nodded. That night, Elena received an email. "Dear Elena, due to program adjustments, you've been moved to open the Spring Classical Showcase. Please arrive early for sound check. Thank you for your flexibility." Music department, no explanation. No warning. But she understood exactly what it meant. They weren't afraid of her failing. They were afraid of her being unforgettable. And in that moment, something inside her broke, not with despair, but with resolve. The Friday before the Spring Classical Showcase, the music wing was unusually quiet. Rehearsals had ended early. Students shuffled through the hallways with cases in hand, talking about dresses, tuxedos, lighting, and post-performance dinner plans. Winslow's biggest night of the year was coming, and for most, it was a celebration. But not for Elena Monroe. She was early, standing alone in the corner of room 203, the smaller practice space where she'd spent weeks shaping her sound in secret. Her violin sat on her lap, untouched. Her hands didn't move, because Ms. Tran wasn't there. For the first time in 3 weeks, Elena had arrived to find the lights off. The room locked. No note. No message. Nothing. By second period, whispers started trickling through the hallway like a broken faucet. "Did you hear about Ms. Tran? They suspended her." "No way." "For what?" "Something about favoritism. They said she overstepped." By third period, Elena had confirmation. An official email from the front office. "To all students and staff, please be advised that Ms. Lon Tran will be on administrative leave pending internal review. Music classes will proceed as scheduled." That was it. No explanation. No defense. Just a red stamp across the only lifeline Elena had in the building. And she knew exactly who had wielded that stamp. Inside the faculty break room, Mr. Blythe stirred cream into his coffee slowly, calmly, methodically. He didn't look up when Ms. Dean, the art teacher, entered. "You heard about Tran?" she asked. Blythe nodded. "Unfortunate. She's one of the few teachers the kids actually trust." Ms. Dean said, folding her arms. "She crossed boundaries," he replied evenly. "Private coaching, use of school equipment after hours, unapproved performance guidance. Those are violations." Ms. Dean raised an eyebrow. "You mean she helped a student?" Blythe set his coffee down. "She created imbalance. That undermines institutional integrity." She didn't reply, just left. Even among the staff, they knew it was personal. But no one said anything. No one wanted to be next. Elena skipped lunch. She sat in the library, surrounded by silent books and loud thoughts. Her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "You're still opening the showcase tomorrow. Don't lose focus." M.E. Her chest tightened. Ms. Tran. Even now, she was thinking about the music. But that wasn't enough. That night, Elena sat at her kitchen table long after her mom had gone to bed. The apartment was dark except for the soft amber light of a single lamp. Her violin sat across the table. She didn't play it. She stared at it like it was a mirror. And then she opened her notebook. On the first page, she wrote one word: rewrite. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about the system that silenced the loud, punished the brave, and tolerated only what was easy to explain. If they were going to try to erase Ms. Tran's name, then Elena would carve it into every note. The next morning, the stage crew arrived early to prepare the auditorium. Mr. Blythe supervised lighting, seating, and run of show. "Performer 1 is already on the board," he asked Kyle, the tech assistant. "Yeah, Elena Monroe. She's ready for early sound check." Blythe smirked. "Good. Let's make sure she's set up properly this time." But Kyle didn't smile back. Not this time. He just nodded and walked away. Something in the air had changed. By evening, the audience had begun filing in. Velvet programs handed out. Ushers in pressed uniforms. Classical music echoing softly from hidden speakers. Backstage, Elena stood in her simple black dress, eyes closed. Her bow was freshly tightened, her strings tuned to perfection. She hadn't asked to open the showcase, but now she was grateful for it. Because when the curtain rose, she wouldn't be an opener. She'd be the reason they stayed. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over Winslow Prep's grand auditorium as the announcer's voice cut through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, opening tonight's Spring Classical Showcase, Elena Monroe." A few scattered claps, murmurs, confused glances. From the audience, no one expected the name. From the students, most hadn't even heard her play. And for those who had, most didn't believe she'd deliver anything memorable. But they hadn't heard this version of her. Backstage, Elena took one last breath, stepped into the light, and walked center stage. She didn't glance at the crowd, didn't look for familiar faces. Not her classmates, not Mr. Blythe, who stood near the back of the room with folded arms. Not even the empty seat Ms. Tran should have been in. She looked at the space just above the first row, the silence between people, and filled it with focus. Then she lifted her violin. The first note hit like a whisper across a frozen lake. Delicate, barely there. Then came the second, heavier, trembling like memory. By the third, the room shifted. Eyes lifted. Phones lowered. Chairs stopped creaking. There was no sheet music in front of her. No page to follow. Every note was mapped from her mind, drawn from a blueprint burned into her by pain, defiance, and love. The piece was called Unfinished Fire, but it wasn't unfinished anymore. In the back of the room, Mr. Blythe's expression hardened. He knew that melody. Not from Elena, from Clarice Monroe. 2 decades ago, at a masterclass in Vienna, he had watched Clarice write that piece, then rip it apart, saying it was too raw, too much of herself. She never played it again, never performed it. But now, her daughter was performing the ghost of that song, and turning it into something unrecognizable and terrifyingly beautiful. Elena didn't just play the notes, she reshaped them. She bent the string on the bridge, making it cry. She double-stopped two dissonant chords, then let them collide into resolution. She slowed where most would rush, accelerated where others held back. Each choice was deliberate. Each phrase was rebellion. In the audience, the students who whispered before now sat frozen. Chloe Stanton clutched her armrest. Even the teachers, half expecting an awkward opener, leaned forward involuntarily. This wasn't a student playing violin. This was someone telling a story they couldn't interrupt. At one point, a single bow stroke held for so long it felt like breath had been taken from the entire auditorium. And when she released it, it sounded like grief, like memory, like something lost being found again. Backstage, the tech assistant stared at the board. No one had touched the mixer. No sabotage tonight. But still, the levels blinked red, not from distortion, but from power. She was playing too loud, but not in volume, in meaning. When the piece ended, Elena stood still. She didn't bow, didn't smile. She let the silence speak. The applause didn't come right away, because no one wanted to be the first to break the moment. And then, one hand clapped. Then another. Then all of them. A standing ovation before the third act. Mr. Blythe did not clap. He didn't move. He couldn't. Because in that moment, he saw Clarice again. Not her face, but her fire. And for the first time in years, he remembered what it felt like to be afraid of someone better than him. Someone he couldn't control. When Elena walked off stage, she passed him in the wings. He opened his mouth, searching for some comment, critique, dismissal, anything to reclaim control. But she didn't stop, didn't even glance at him. She just walked by, her violin still vibrating in her hand like it wasn't done talking yet. And somewhere, sitting in a parked car across the street, Ms. Tran was watching a live stream on her phone. Tears welled in her eyes as the chat filled with comments. Who is she? This is not high school level. That girl just changed the whole room. She smiled through the tears and whispered, "Make them remember you." The ovation still rang through the auditorium as Elena stepped behind the curtain, heart pounding like a second metronome beneath her skin. Sweat lined her brow. Her fingers trembled, not from nerves, but from adrenaline. She had done it. She hadn't just played. She had spoken, with strings and soul and silence between the notes. The crowd stood for her. The school rose for her. And somewhere deep down, a part of her thought, maybe now, maybe this is the moment everything shifts. But not everyone stood. Near the back of the auditorium, Mr. Jackson Blythe remained rooted in his seat, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes narrowed with cold calculation. He didn't look angry. He looked cornered. As the final claps dwindled and the MC thanked the audience, Blythe stood up, not to join the applause, but to leave. He walked out not through the back exit, but straight down the side aisle, where everyone could see. A few teachers exchanged glances. Students turned their heads, confused. Even the principal, seated near the front, furrowed his brow as Blythe passed without a word. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was deliberate. A silent rejection, delivered in full view. Backstage, Elena sat on a folding chair, her violin resting beside her like a sleeping animal. The sound of applause had faded. She was alone again, until Chloe Stanton stepped into the green room. For a moment, neither girl said anything. Then Chloe broke the silence. "I don't like being wrong," she said flatly. Elena blinked. "Excuse me." "You're better than I thought," Chloe said, folding her arms. He would reference lack of professional oversight, inappropriate coaching from suspended staff, and circumvented protocol. It was a long shot, but it didn't have to succeed. It just had to slow her down, because that was how the system worked. Not by screaming no, but by quietly saying not yet. Not now, not you. But what Blythe didn't know, what he never considered, was that someone had been recording. Not the official school camera, a student. From the third row, a clean, clear shot. Sound perfect, angle steady, emotion undeniable. And they had already uploaded it. No names, no tags, just the title. She opened the show and ended the room. Within 24 hours, it had 11,000 views. By morning, it had 73,000. By the time Blythe filed his complaint, it had already crossed 500,000. And in every comment under every share, one question kept repeating: who is Elena Monroe? The video kept climbing. By midweek, the clip of Elena's performance had gone viral across classical music forums, teen creator pages, and even a trending spot on a niche music subchannel on YouTube. Comments poured in by the second. This isn't just a performance. This is resistance. I've never heard pain and power sound so elegant. Why hasn't she been signed yet? Elena didn't know how to respond. She wasn't chasing fame. She didn't even own a TikTok account. But now, people knew her name. And not just kids. 2 days after the showcase, Elena received a message request on her school email from a regional music scholarship foundation. The subject line read, "We saw your performance. Let's talk." But by lunchtime, that email was buried beneath another. This one from Winslow Prep's administration. Dear MS. Monroe, following a post-performance review of conduct, attire, and procedural compliance, we regret to inform you that you are no longer eligible for advancement in the Regional Youth Classical Tour. Your removal is based on failure to wear approved showcase performance attire, omission of pre-performance acknowledgments, unauthorized use of original composition. Without departmental review, we appreciate your contributions and encourage you to continue your musical journey. The subject line was cold. Disqualification notice effective immediately. Elena, read it again. Then again. She hadn't been told about a dress code violation. No one had reminded her about a required bow or acknowledgement. And the composition? That was hers. Every note. She walked straight to the front office, trying to keep her voice level as she asked for an explanation. The receptionist handed her a printed version of the rules. They were vague, full of administrative jargon. Everything could be twisted to mean something else. And that was the point. Meanwhile, Mr. Blythe stood behind his desk, speaking softly into a landline phone. "Yes," he said. "It's already been issued. No backlash on our end yet. If it comes, we'll cite policy. We've done it before." He hung up and exhaled slowly. He wasn't just trying to stop Elena anymore. He was trying to erase her trajectory before it became unstoppable. But something gnawed at him. He hadn't expected the video to blow up. He hadn't expected the public to see her. He had only prepared for internal sabotage. Now, she was bigger than the showcase. And more dangerously, she was bigger than his control. Elena sat alone in the library that afternoon, staring at the disqualification letter on her phone screen. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She wanted to reply, to fight it, to scream. But what would she say? "You're lying?" They knew. This is unfair. They didn't care. Then her phone buzzed. A text. No name. Just a number she didn't recognize. "They're trying to freeze you out, just like they did your mom. M.E. MS. Tran." Elena blinked. She had never told MS. Tran about her mom. Not the full story. Not how Clarice Monroe had once been on track to become one of the youngest black violinists signed to the Philharmonic. Not how that track was derailed by a quiet, persistent campaign of bureaucracy and concerns. But MS. Tran knew. Of course she did. She had lived through it. Elena typed back, "Then I guess it runs in the family. They don't want to stop me. They want to unwrite me." That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she took out her violin and began rewriting the very piece they claimed had no authorization. She reworked every passage, layered in direct quotes from academic compositions, added written notation, built it with such structural integrity that it couldn't be questioned, not even by a biased committee. And when she finished, she renamed it Amendment in G minor, because it wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a challenge. Monday morning felt different. Elena knew something had changed the moment she stepped into the school lobby. The air was charged, not with tension, but with curiosity. People didn't whisper when she walked by. They stared. Not cruelly, not mockingly, but like they had just seen her in a way they weren't ready for. She didn't check her phone yet. Not until second period, when Malik, a quiet student from AV Club, slipped into her desk row, leaned over and whispered, "It's out." Elena blinked. "What?" He slid his phone across the desk. The screen was already paused on a YouTube video. Title: Caught in the Act. Winslow Music Director Sabotages Student Performance. Length: 3 minutes, 22 seconds. Uploader: Anonymous. First frame: security footage from the tech booth, time-stamped during the spring preview. Second frame: Mr. Blythe leaning over Kyle Hastings, pointing at the mixer, whispering something. Third frame: audio kicks in grainy but clear. Keep the mics balanced. But if performer 14, if their violin output feels a bit overpowering, bring it down. You mean live. Trust your ears. We don't want the equipment outshining the skill, do we? Cut. Next section: backstage hallway. Phone camera footage. Mr. Blythe pacing. On a call. "I'm telling you, she's not ready. We can't have her representing this program. If she plays, I want her up front and out quick." Final clip: classroom audio. Mr. Blythe speaking to another teacher. "You give one of them too much space, they'll take the whole stage. It's our job to protect the tradition." The video ended. No voiceover. No music. Just silence. And then, thousands of comments. "He said that out loud? This is academic sabotage. Fire him." The girl played like a storm, and he tried to kill the rain. Winslow Prep has some explaining to do. By the time Elena returned the phone, her hands were trembling. Across campus, Mr. Blythe had locked his office door. The first email had come in just before 7 a.m., a journalist from a local education watchdog. Then another from the Regional Classical Conservatory. Then a call from the school board chair. Now, students passed his door whispering. Teachers avoided eye contact. The curtain had lifted. In the cafeteria, Principal Hayes stood before a hastily arranged staff meeting. "We're initiating a full investigation," he said, his voice forced calm. "Effective immediately, Mr. Blythe has been placed on administrative leave pending review." No one asked why. They didn't need to. Some looked relieved, others nervous. But everyone knew this wasn't just about one girl with a violin. This was about the system and the man who had twisted it. By afternoon, Clarice Monroe sat in her apartment, watching the video for the 5th time. She hadn't wanted her daughter to carry this. Not this fight. Not again. But watching Elena stand tall in the chaos, calm, poised, unchanged, made something inside her shift. For years, she had stayed quiet, stayed out of the spotlight, let the past bury itself under motherhood and distance. But now, the world was remembering, and so was she. That evening, Elena opened her phone to a flood of messages: journalists, music directors, radio producers, students from other schools. But one message stopped her cold. "Hi, Elena. I don't know if you remember me. My name is Naomi Kessler. I was your mom's cellist back in '02. We've been waiting for her return for years. Turns out we got something better. You. And we want you to headline our Summer Youth Virtuoso series in New York. All expenses covered. Bring your bow." That night, Elena walked out onto the rooftop of her building. Wind curled around her. City lights blinked in the distance. She didn't cry, didn't celebrate. She just whispered 2 words into the sky: "She saw me." She didn't say who, but deep down, she knew it was all of them. MS, Tran, her mother, herself. A week after the video broke, Winslow Preparatory's auditorium filled again. But this time, there was no showcase, no judge's clipboard, no curated applause. This was different. The school had called it a community reconciliation concert. The press called it a reckoning. Local news outlets camped by the main entrance. Regional radio streamed live. Students wore black in silent solidarity. A petition to reinstate MS. Tran had gathered 28,000 signatures. Blythe's office door remained permanently closed. And on stage, a single folding chair sat under the light. Beside it, a second one, reserved but empty. Elena stood behind the curtain, her violin in hand. She wasn't nervous, not anymore, but something felt unfinished. Then, quiet footsteps behind her. She turned and saw her mother. Elena Monroe stepped into the backstage light like she'd never left it. No gown, no glitter, just a charcoal suit, sharp as ever, and eyes that held storms and sunrise in equal measure. Elena's throat caught. "You came." Clarice smiled. "They tried to silence me once, remember? You just made sure they'd never do it to you." She looked down at the second chair on stage. "May I?" she asked. Elena nodded. Together, they stepped out into the light. The auditorium erupted in thunderous applause, not the kind of noise that begged to be clapped at, but the kind that thanked someone for surviving. Elena took her seat. Clarice sat beside her, and the crowd hushed. Without a word, Elena lifted her violin. Her bow hovered, then struck, not with violence, but with precision. The opening notes of Amendment in G minor unfolded like a wound being stitched mid-air. Clarice followed with a harmony so delicate it felt like breath. The duet danced. Two generations, one once silenced, one now undeniable, telling the story no textbook ever printed. Each movement of the piece struck deeper than the last. One section echoed Clarice's discarded Carnegie audition. Another whispered the melody Elena had rewritten from the Sabotage. And then came the bridge, the part no one had heard before. The strings tangled, then rose, then soared. Ms. Tran watched from the side of the stage, reinstated, tears streaking quietly down her cheeks. Principal Hayes stood nearby, his arms crossed, not in resistance, but in surrender. Because what do you do when the truth plays so loud you can't talk over it? As the final note lingered, the room stood, every student, every teacher, every stranger. Elena lowered her violin. Clarice placed her bow across her lap, like a finished letter. Neither of them bowed. They just looked out at the room, finally quiet for the right reason. Later, Elena stepped out into the school courtyard. The moon hung low over the trees. The air smelled like rain was near. Clarice joined her. "For years," her mother said, "I thought quitting was the only way to protect my peace." She looked at her daughter. "But you showed me that peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from making them listen." Elena smiled faintly. "You taught me more than you think." They stood there a moment longer, two silhouettes against a sky full of unfinished stories. The next day, national headlines ran. The girl who played through the system, mother, daughter, music that broke the mold. Winslow violinist rewrites history in G minor. The video of the final performance reached 2.3 million views in 48 hours. Conservatories called. Scholarships followed. Labels listened. But Elena? She didn't care about the offers. Because this was never about being discovered. It was about being seen. The following week, Ms. Tran returned to the music room and found something resting on the front piano. A printed sheet of music. Untitled. Handwritten. At the bottom, a note. For every student they tried to mute. Play it louder. E.M. Because sometimes, a violin isn't just an instrument. It's a voice. And Elena Monroe? She never asked for permission. She just played. So they'd never forget again. And now, we ask you, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We want to know who this story reached. If Elena's journey moved you, inspired you, or made you feel seen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because the world needs more stories where silence doesn't win. Thank you for watching. And remember, play your truth, even if no one claps at first.